Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And today's topics are Pepe on BRICS, Palestine, and Alastair, that is Alastair Crook, on the Euro Mutiny. Hello, Steve Wolfbrand. How are you doing? Good to see you here. I'm going to start immediately with Pepe's new piece. It's entitled The BRICS Weigh In on Palestine. Hang on a second while I share things to Facebook. Sorry, my computer's giving me a little bit of trouble here. And I can't seem to share what I need to share. Do-do-do. Da-da-da-da-da. Mm-hmm. Okay, that does it. So, the title of Pepe's new piece is The BRICS Weigh In on Palestine. And it was published on June 15th, 2024. Here's a picture of all the people. Of all the BRICS nations between 2020 and 2024. These are BRICS ministers of foreign affairs. The gravity around the newly enlarged BRICS constellation is drawing in Arab, Muslim, and Global South adherents to the influential group's message on international law, Palestine, and halting forever wars. Moscow, something of extraordinary magnitude happened in Moscow on the 23rd of May. Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa personally asked Russian President Vladimir Putin to help organize a peace conference on Palestine. at which Russia would be the first non-Arab nation invited. Al-Khalifa and Putin had 2 rounds of discussions, one of them closed, during which the main focus was always Palestine. The Bahraini monarch noted that in a rare show of unity, the Arab world had finally come together in agreement to end the war in Gaza. It was implied that Russia was subsequently chosen as the most reliable mediator to end the brutal conflict. Bahrain and the Arab League recognized that the Russian position centers around what Putin had previously defined as the UN formula, quote unquote, an independent Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. That happens to be the position of the BRICS 10 nations and virtually the whole global majority. It is also the common position of China and the Arab world, reaffirmed in Beijing only 1 week after the Russia-Bahrain meeting. The problem is how to implement the, quote, formula, unquote, when the U.S. hegemon, Israel's unconditional ally, has a virtual stranglehold on the United Nations. By 2020, as Tel Aviv was openly announcing the inevitable annexation of the West Bank, the Abraham Accords was smashing a major Arab taboo on openly supporting Israel via the normalization agreements signed in Washington, D.C. by Bahrain, the UAE, also Morocco, and Sudan. 9 months ago, Palestine was virtually isolated and destined to extinction via quiet Israeli policies to incrementally force expulsion. But never underestimate the power of a genocide committed in broad daylight on video. Today, the Russia-China Strategic Partnership, BRICS, and the global majority have been mobilized to enshrine Palestine as a sovereign state, faithful to the recent supermajority UN General Assembly vote to accept Palestine as a UN member. It will be a long, winding, and thorny road that has the potential to split the world in two. Lavrov lays it all out. The St. Petersburg Forum last week offered 3 crucial messages to the global majority, focused around BRICS. The crux of the sessions may have been geoeconomics, but a now unavoidable message of support to Palestine crept into the sidelines after a panel ostensibly debating the supply and demand of oil and gas, and which touched upon the principled role of Yemen in the Red Sea, directed against the Gaza genocide. Support for Palestine amidst friendly smiles, but off the record, was emphatic from everyone, from OPEC's Secretary General Haytham Al-Ghais to the UAE's Minister of Energy, Suhail Mohammed Al-Mazroui. Same on a Russia-Oman panel, coming from Minister of Commerce Bakayas bin Mohammed bin Musa al-Youssef. Earlier this year, the Palestine tragedy was addressed in detail on points 34 and 35 in the joint statement of the BRICS to ministers of foreign affairs, who sat at the same table for the first time in Nizhny Novgorod, preparing for the extremely important annual BRICS summit next October in Kazan under the Russian presidency. 3 very important points were made there. First, the ministers reaffirmed their rejection of any attempt aiming at forcefully displacing, expelling, or transferring the Palestinian people from their land, unquote. Second, they, quote, expressed serious concern at Israel's continued blatant disregard of international law, the UN Charter, UN resolutions, and court orders, unquote. And third, the 10 foreign ministers reaffirmed their support for Palestine's full membership in the United Nations and reiterated their unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution based on international law, including relevant UN Security Council and UN General Assembly resolutions, and the Arab Peace Initiative that included the establishment of a sovereign, independent, and viable state of Palestine in line with internationally recognized borders of June 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel, unquote. This is BRICS speaking with one voice, including, crucially, representatives of major Muslim majority states, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, at an expanded BRICS session defined as BRICS Plus BRICS Outreach, offered extra important context. And here's a quote from Lavrov. We held an intra-Palestinian meeting in Moscow. We did this repeatedly. The last time it was held in late February and early March of this year, all Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Fatah, were present. For the first time, an event of this kind ended with the adoption of a joint statement in which everyone, including Hamas, expressed their readiness to unite the Palestinian ranks on the basis of the platform of the PLO. Previously, it was not possible to achieve this. Lavrov explained why, for Russia, it is essential to restore Palestinian unity. Quote, only a united Palestine can be a partner in negotiations aimed at achieving the maximum desired outcome. As long as the Palestinians are divided, this is unlikely to work. Now, without any Palestinians, they are beginning to think about what to do with the Gaza Strip next, either to establish some kind of protectorate of Arab countries, or to introduce some peacekeeping force, or to artificially declare that these will be territories governed by the Palestinian National Authority. These are all initiatives that are imposed by external players, unquote. That brings us to the kernel of the Russian position. Quote, the most important component of our long-term policy in this area be to support the movement for the creation of a Palestinian state in full compliance with UN resolutions, unquote. How to respond, quote, symmetrically, unquote. All the above sums up the carefully calibrated official Russian position. Moscow abhors Israel's non-stop, irrational escalation, while ceasefire proposals are on hand galore. At the same time, it won't take sides, either with Hamas or with Yemen's Ansar Allah. It is a consensus diplomats and Russian analysts routinely express. Russia will not get into a war thousands of kilometers away when it is fighting a US-NATO existential threat right at its western border. After Putin's question in the Q&A following his address to the plenary session in St. Petersburg, debate raged on what sort of, quote, symmetrical, unquote, responses Russia's Ministry of Defense would come up with to counterpunch NATO's green light for strikes with long-range missiles inside the Russian Federation. West Asia predictably features in the favorite scenario. Advanced strike weapons deployed in Syria, described as, quote, Syrian weapons, unquote, to mirror the West's, quote, Ukrainian weapons, unquote, subterfuge. These would supplement arms already deployed at Russia's Khmeimim and Tartus bases covering the eastern part of the Mediterranean, also Lebanon, Israel, and U.S. bases in Jordan, occupied Syria and occupied Iraq, and would be operated by Russian personnel, much as U.S. NATO personnel operate, quote, Ukrainian, unquote, weapons, a BRICS thorn. Now we come to the thorn in the BRICS flower arrangement, Saudi Arabia. A discombobulated White House and U.S. deep state seem to have found a formula to wean Riyadh away from its new role as strong BRICS player. A landmark defense treaty, dubbed the Strategic Alliance Agreement, in the wings, awaiting Riyadh's formalization of relations with Tel Aviv. The Strategic Alliance would need to get a two-thirds majority vote in the U.S. Senate, yet insistence on, quote, normalization with Israel, unquote, may well kill the deal. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman now has options to carefully consider, not only regarding the Gaza tragedy, but over his new BRICS alliances. Riyadh's official position on Palestine is tied up with BRICS. End of the war / genocide in Gaza and the establishment of a Palestinian state. And every grain of sand in the lands of Islam is fully aware that a Tel Aviv ruled by an ethnocentric mob of extremists won't accept a two-state solution. Moreover, a Saudi-U.S. military alliance is totally incompatible with Riyadh becoming an influential member of BRICS. Chessboard moves are instead pointing to, sooner or later, a possible global majority military alliance to counterpunch the escalating U.S.-NATO war, hybrid and otherwise, against the dawning of a multinodal, polycentric, and in Putin's terminology in St. Petersburg, harmonic multipolar world. Add to it the expiration earlier this year of the U.S.-Saudi agreement signed 50 years ago to establish the petrodollar, essentially in exchange for U.S. military protection. Already last year, Riyadh made it clear the agreement would not be renewed when it clinched a deal with China based on energy trade using the petro yuan. So in theory, we are advancing further on down the road towards a demise of the petrodollar and with the expansion of the digital yuan. The Central Bank of Saudi Arabia is now a, quote, full participant, unquote, of Project mBridge, which unites the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, that is, Innovation Hub, the Central Bank of Thailand, the Central Bank of the UAE, the People's Bank of China, and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Essentially, mBridge is a multi-central bank digital currency platform shared among central banks and commercial banks and enabling instant cross-border payments and settlements. Thailand, for instance, is buying oil from the UAE using mBridge. There are no less than 26 mBridge observers, quite a mixed bag, including the China-led Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the World Bank. As Saudi Arabia joins mBridge, Saudi Aramco, after opening itself to foreign investors with a huge IPO, has just seeded an extra 0.64% of its capital, with 60% of the buyers American. Aramco is a humongous fountain of dividends for shareholders. This year, that will amount to a whopping $141 billion. Guess who are the top new investors? The big three, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, now all wallowing in Saudi oil. Arab, CENTCOM, and Israel in bed together? And now for the ultimate complicating factor. On Monday, military officers from Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, which includes 3 BRICS members and Russia-friendly Bahrain, met with Herzi Halevi, the IDF's Chief of General Staff, to discuss defense cooperation. Isn't that amazing? The meeting was facilitated by none other than the U.S. CENTCOM, that's the Central Command, of course. Although as low profile as it gets, the meeting still leaked, given the juxtaposition of the Gaza genocide alongside a meeting of top Arab leaders sitting with the Arab world's worst enemies. A postmodern epigony of the cynics dwelling in the Agora in ancient Greece would remark that the CENTCOM Arab, quote, friends, unquote, like these, 3 of them BRICS members, Palestine, does not need enemies. Meanwhile, the tragedy persists on so many levels as Chinese high school students all across the civilization state show their support for Palestine after taking their university entrance exams. The U.S.-Israel axis homogenizes terrorism linked to the debacle of Project Ukraine, coupled with the nonstop killing of Palestinians. Everything is being sucked into the black hole of terrorism, complete with NATO now openly rearming the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion and Kyiv, targeting civilians in Belgorod with drones and scattering mines in parks where kids play. All components of the hegemon-fed terror foreign legion are coming together in lockstep with Israel, which is essentially ISIS with nuclear weapons. But for all their lofty ideals and sacred belief in the UN, the BRICS still have not come up with a solid, practical strategy to fight the horror. So this piece states the reservations that Pepe Escobar has about the commitment of BRICS to Palestine, even though the verbal commitments are all over the place. And we're seeing also Russian moral support and a possible role, as a mediator. The thorn in the flower arrangement is Saudi and what Saudi will do, whether it will go ahead with the normalization of Israeli-Saudi relationships, or whether it will step back and insist on the two-state solution first. So Saudi is currently splitting. It has 1 foot in BRICS and 1 foot in new security arrangements with the United States, and Israel. Which way will it go? Can it possibly go both ways? I don't know if it can go both ways. But it turns out there are American investors involved. Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. This is very complicated. As Pepe makes clear, in this particular piece. When will the Arabs come up with a solid, practical strategy to fight the horror the West is trying to construct and trying to implement? Pepe doesn't know when they'll come up with such a strategy, and I don't know either. All we do know is that BRICS has not come up with one, as yet. So that's certainly something to notice. Robert Copeland says, I'm not a fan of BRICS. I know, Robert. Why not? Why are you not a fan of BRICS? Anyway, I want to move to a very good piece by Alastair Crook at this point, the second of our topics, for tonight. This one was also from the UN's report. By the way, the piece I just read was actually originally from the Cradle, but I picked it up at the UN's report because I thought it was, since I was doing the Alastair Crook article also, it was convenient to take them from the same place. Title of this piece by Alastair Crook written on June 14th, 2024, is European uh, Euro mutiny at the illiberal order. Because even though Europe claims to be very liberal, okay, a liberal polity, and talks through all the liberal values, uh, it is actually governed by a very illiberal order, and we'll discuss that in this piece. The mutiny has arisen because many in the West see only too clearly that the Western ruling structure is an illiberal, mechanical, quote, control system, unquote. I have been writing for some time, says Alastair, that Europe and the US are in a period of alternate revolution and civil war. History warns us that such conflicts tend to be extended, with peak episodes which are revolutionary as the prevailing paradigm first cracks, yet which in reality are both but alternate modes of the same thing, a quote, toggling, unquote, between revolutionary peaks and the slow, quote, slog, unquote, of intense cultural war. We are, I believe, in such an era. Excuse me. I also have suggested that a nascent counter-revolution was slowly gathering, one defiantly unwilling to recant traditionalist moral values, nor prepared to submit to an oppressive, illiberal international order posing as a liberal. What I had not expected was that the, quote, first shoe to drop, unquote, would occur in Europe. That it would be France. That would be the first to break the illiberal mold. I had thought that it would break first in the United States. The European Member of Parliament election, MEP election, outcome may come to be viewed as the, quote, first swallow, unquote, in signaling a substantive change in the weather. There are to be snap elections in Britain, France, and Germany, as well as much of Europe is in a state of political disarray. Have no illusions, though. The cold reality is that Western, quote, power structures, unquote, own the wealth, the key institutions in society, and the levers of enforcement. To be plain, they hold the, quote, commanding heights. How will they manage a West edging towards moral, political, and possibly financial collapse? Most likely by doubling down with no compromise. And that predictable, quote, doubling down, unquote, will not necessarily be confined to fights within the Colosseum arena, quote unquote. It will certainly impinge into high risk geopolitics. Undoubtedly, U.S. structures will have been deeply disconcerted by the European election portent. What does the European anti-establishment mutiny imply for those ruling structures in Washington, especially at a time when all the world sees Joe Biden visibly wobbling? How will they distract us, quote unquote, from this first crack to their international structural edifice? Already, there is U.S.-led military escalation, ostensibly connected to Ukraine, but whose objective clearly is to provoke Russia into retaliation by incrementally escalating NATO violations of Russia's strategic red lines, quote unquote. It seems that the U.S. hawks seek to gain the escalatory advantage over Moscow, leaving to Moscow the dilemma of how far to retaliate. The Western elites do not fully believe the warnings from Moscow, which, of course, we've been seeing over the last week and a half or so, This provocation ploy might conceivably offer either a crafted image of the U.S. Winning, quote unquote, staring down Putin, or alternatively come to provide a pretext to postpone the U.S. elections as global tensions spike. I really can't imagine that. It's almost inconceivable to me that the Biden administration would think it could get away with postponing presidential elections. Oh, that's a big deal. I mean, that didn't even happen in World War II. Their guy giving the permanent state time to get its quote, ducks in lined up, unquote, to manage an early Biden succession. This calculus, however, is contingent on how soon Ukraine implodes, either militarily or politically. An earlier than expected Ukraine implosion, such as, say, next week, might become the staging for a U.S. pivot to the Taiwan front, a contingency that already is being prepared. Why is Europe, why are they in mutiny? The mutiny has arisen because many in the West now see only too clearly that the Western ruling structure is no liberal project per se, but rather is an avowedly illiberal mechanical, quote, control system, unquote, that is a managerial technocracy that fraudulently poses as a liberal order. Clearly, many in Europe are alienated from the establishment. The causes may be multiple: Ukraine, immigration, or falling living standards. Yet all Europeans are versed in the narrative that history has bent to the long arc of liberalism in the post-Cold War period. Yet that has proved illusory. The reality has been control, surveillance, censorship, technocracy, lockdowns, and climate emergency. That has been the reality here in the United States as well, I believe. Illiberalism, even quasi-totalitarianism in short. I call it inverted totalitarianism. Von der Leyen took things further recently, arguing that, quote, if you think of information manipulation as a virus, instead of treating an infection once it has taken hold, it is much better to vaccinate so that the body is inoculated, unquote. What then did traditional liberalism in the loosest definition, or when then did it turn illiberal? The about face came in the 1970s. In 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was to become National Security Advisor to President Carter, published a book entitled Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era. In it, Brzezinski argued the Technocratic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society, such a society dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values, and practicing continuous surveillance over every citizen, together with the manipulation of the behavior and intellectual functioning of all people, would become the new norm, unquote. Elsewhere, he argued that, quote, the nation state as a fundamental unit of man's organized life has ceased to be the principal creative force. International banks and multinational corporations are acting and planning in terms that are far in advance of the political concepts of the nation state, unquote, i.e., business cosmopolitanism is the future. David Rockefeller and the power brokers around him, together with his Bilderberg grouping, seized on Brzezinski's insight to represent the third leg to ensuring that the 21st century would indeed be the quote American century, unquote. The other two legs were control of oil resources and dollar hegemony. Then followed a key report of the limits to growth, 1971 Club of Rome, again a Rockefeller creation, which provided the deeply flawed, quote, scientific, unquote, underpinning to Brzezinski. It predicted an end to civilization owing to population growth, combined with depleting resources, including and especially depleting energy resources. This dire prediction was imputed to say that only economic experts, tech experts, leaders of multinational corporations and banks had the foresight and technical understanding to manage society subject to the complexity of limits to growth. Limits to growth was a mistake. It was flawed, yet that did not matter. President Clinton's advisor to the UN Rio conference, Tim Wirth, admitted the error, yet cheerfully added, quote, we have got to ride the global warming issue, even if the theory is wrong. We will be doing the, quote, right thing, unquote, in terms of economic policy, unquote. The proposition was wrong, but the policy was right. Economic policy was upended based on faulty analysis. He seems to be saying here that the global warming analysis is wrong. But of course, we see evidence of it continuously, and we see many different forecasts now completely validating the global warming issue. And we see it before us. It's very hard to doubt that there has been such a thing as a global warming. But Alastair goes on. The proposition was wrong, but the policy was right. Economic policy was upended based on faulty analysis. The godfather to the further pivot to totalitarianism, apart from David Rockefeller, was his protege and later Klaus Schwab's indispensable advisor, quote unquote, Maurice Strong. William Engdahl has written how, quote, circles directly tied to David Rockefeller and Strong in the 1970s birthed a dazzling array of elite private invitation organizations and think tanks, unquote. These included the Neo-Malthusian Club of Rome, the MIT authored study of limits to growth, unquote, and the Trilateral Commission, unquote. The Trilateral Commission, however, was the secretive heart to the matrix, quote. When Carter took office in January 1976, Carter took office in January 1977. His cabinet was drawn almost entirely from the ranks of Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission to such an astonishing degree that some Washington insiders called it the, quote, Rockefeller presidency. They called Jimmy Carter's presidency the Rockefeller presidency. Engdahl writes. Craig Carpel in 1977 also wrote, the presidency of the United States and the key cabinet departments of the federal government have been taken over by a private organization dedicated to the subordination of the domestic interests of the United States to the international interests of the multinational banks and corporations. It would be unfair to say that the Trilateral Commission dominates the Carter administration. The Trilateral Commission is the Carter administration, unquote. Quote, every key U.S. government, foreign, and economic policy post since Carter has been held by a trilateral, Engdahl writes. And so it continues, a matrix of overlapping membership that is little visible to the public and which very loosely may be said to have constituted the, quote, permanent state, unquote. Did it exist in Europe? Yes, branches across Europe. Here lies the route to last week's European mutiny, unquote. Many Europeans refuse the concept of a controlled universe. Many are defiantly unwilling to recant their traditional ways of life or their national allegiances. The Rockefeller Faustian bargain of the 1970s had one narrow segment of the American ruling cadre seceding from the American nation to occupy a separate reality in which they disassembled an organic economy to the benefit of the oligarchy, with compensation coming only from their embrace of identity politics and the just rotation of some diversity into corporate executive suites. Looked at in this way, the Rockefeller deal can be viewed as a parallel to the South African arrangement that ended apartheid. The Anglo elites held on to economic resources and power, whilst the ANC on the other side of the equation got a Potemkin facade of their taking political power. For Europeans, this Faustian arrangement degrades humans down to identity units, occupying the spaces between markets, rather than markets being the ancillary to an organic, human-centered economy, as Karl Polanyi wrote some 80 years ago in The Great Transformation. He traced the turmoil of his era down to one cause: the belief that society can and should be organized through self-regulating markets. For him, this represented nothing less than an ontological break with much of human history. Prior to the 19th century, he insisted the human economy had always been, quote, embedded, unquote, in society. It was subordinated to local politics, customs, religion, and social relations. The converse, Rockefeller's technocratic, illiberal come identity paradigm, leads only to the attenuation of social bonds, the atomization of community, to the lack of metaphysical content, and thus to an absence of existential purpose in meetings. But illiberalism is unfilling. It says, you don't count, you don't belong. Many Europeans evidently now get it, which somehow takes us back to the question of how the Western strata will react to the mutiny against the international order that has been accelerating across the globe and which has now surfaced in Europe, albeit with diverse colorations and some ideological baggage. It is not likely for now that the ruling strata will compromise. Those who dominate tend to fear existentially. Either they keep dominating or they lose all. They see only a zero-sum game. Each side's status becomes frozen. People increasingly meet only as adversaries. Co-citizens become dangerous threats who must be opposed. So consider the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Leaders in the U.S. ruling strata comprise many zealous supporters of a Zionist Israel. As the international order starts to crack, this segment of the structural power in the U.S. is likely to be uncompromising too, fearing a zero-sum outcome. There is an Israeli narrative to the war and a, quote, rest of the world narrative, and they don't really meet. How to arrange things? The transformative effect of seeing, quote, others, unquote, differently, Israelis and Palestinians, presently is not on the table. That conflict has the potential to get much worse and for longer. Might the, quote, ruling strata, desperate for a certain outcome, seek to fold and try to conceal the horrors of this West Asian struggle within a wider geostrategic war, one in which great multitudes become displaced, thus dwarfing a regional horror? Question mark. I think that's a very imaginative analysis, very striking. Uh, I don't see where the BRICS fit in here, though. It seems to me the movers and shakers are the Trilateral Commission and the think tanks that surround the Trilateral Commission, okay, and the oligarchy but it doesn't seem like the nations themselves are movers and shakers. And yet, with the nations coming together in BRICS, it also now seems that we will see nations be the movers and shakers. In spite of this analysis, and in spite of the misgivings Pepe has about the possible uh, new flower arrangements involving Saudi Arabia and Israel, which we previously discussed. I don't think the world is again going to be controlled by the Bilderberg group. I think that the BRICS nations will take over control, and with the willing help of China, okay, and also Russia. So those are the two topics for today. I hope you enjoyed them. They are pretty deep in terms of the analysis. Robert Copeland says, one of the BRICS nations, namely Russia, is also committing war crimes, namely attacking civilian targets in Ukraine, and they have done so in the past when they attacked Georgia several years ago. I think we will find that when the international courts get into the Ukraine question, Robert, that they will find that many more war crimes have been committed by the Ukrainians, okay, than by the Russians, who tried their best to avoid civilian targets through this whole war, while, of course, it's the Ukrainians have been locking in on civilian targets inside, okay, of Russia, which they continue to do until this day. So okay, that's what I think about that. Well, there are very few comments here today, so I think I'm going to end this stream early. So I thank you all for coming. Those of you who have come, I don't know what kind of competition I'm getting right at the moment, but look at the attendance tonight has been much smaller, less than half of what I've been getting lately. So, now it just went up to 9 folks, but we are ending right now. Robert Copeland asked me if I'm joking. No, Robert, I'm not joking. The human rights violations are mostly on the other side. They're not by Russia. I don't know where you get your information, but it's not the same places I am getting my information. And no, I'm not getting my information from Russia. I'm getting my information from very many objective observers who've been following the war without bias, either for the West, okay, or against the West, thinking in terms of reality, okay, and realism. So no, I am not joking. But thank you for coming, and I will now end the stream.